All right, let's pull back the curtain on history, shall we? We're going to step away from the big name generals and the epic battle maps for a minute. Instead, we're diving into what life was really like for the average soldier in the Civil War. This is a story about survival, yeah, but it's also about incredible boredom and, well, just trying to stay human when everything around you is chaos.
We've all seen those dramatic paintings, right? Pickett's Charge, the Siege of Vicksburg. But here's the thing, those terrifying moments, they were often separated by weeks, sometimes even months of just waiting. So the big question is, what on earth did they do with all that downtime? What was life actually like for these guys? And this is something you've really got to wrap your head around. The transformation these men went through was just immense. It was jarring. I mean, think about it. One day, you're a farmer, you're your own boss. Literally the next, you're a private taking orders. That postmaster you've known your whole life, he's now your officer and you have to salute him. You go from being, well, you, to being just one tiny part of this giant military machine. Can you imagine the whiplash?
Okay, so that brings us to our first section. From farm to formation, the shock of a new reality. And boy, was it a shock. This was the rude awakening. Soldiering was not all glory and parades, not by a long shot. It was endless, back-breaking work, what they called fatigue duties. We're talking chopping wood, grooming horses, clearing entire fields, all while learning to obey any order instantly without a single question.
And man, this new life was just so isolating. You couldn't just, take a weekend off. Nope. Every single man was needed, so getting a trip home to see your family, that was a luxury almost nobody got. Seriously, the world you left behind might as well have been on another planet. And that brings us to a really important word for any soldier, furlough. The official definition is a leave of absence from military duty granted to a soldier. But for these guys, a furlough was so much more than a vacation. It was like winning the lottery. It was a golden ticket, this incredibly rare chance to just step back into your old life, even for a little while.
Right, so if they couldn't go home, where did they live? Let's talk about that. Section 2. A soldier's canvas home. Shelter from the storm. When the army was on the move, it was basically a massive pop-up city of white canvas tents. Just try to picture it, a sea of tents all shrouded in the smoke from thousands of campfires. And the main shelter they had was something called a dog tent. Officially, it's a small, two-man shelter tent made from two canvas pieces. But the name really tells you everything you need to know. The soldiers joked that only a dog could actually crawl under it and stay dry. And for the Confederates, well, they often weren't even issued tents, so their best bet was to capture one from a Union soldier. But obviously, when winter hit, that flimsy canvas just wasn't going to cut it. The cold was brutal. So the armies would actually stop campaigning for the season and build entire cities of log huts to survive the freezing months. We're talking about massive winter camps. And listen, these weren't just some crude lean-tos. The soldiers got really creative. They'd notch logs to get a super tight fit, then they'd pack the gaps with mud to keep the cold out. They even built little fireplaces inside for warmth. But my favorite detail, the most human part, they would give their little huts these grand names from places back home, like Madigan's Oyster House. It's such a small thing, but what a powerful way to hang on to a piece of civilization, right? Okay, so now we get to the real nitty-gritty, the core purpose of being a soldier. Drill, drums, and discipline, the making of a fighting man. Everything else, the camp life, the endless waiting, all that marching, it was all about one thing, turning regular guys into an effective fighting force. Their main tool of the trade was the rifle musket. This thing weighed about 8.5 pounds and was the standard weapon for the infantry. And you see that mean-looking bayonet on the end? Turns out it was pretty useful off the battlefield, too. Guys would use it as a candle holder or even to grind their coffee beans. Pretty resourceful. Now, the ammunition for that rifle, that's where things get really grim. It was called the mini-ball. It's a conical, soft lead bullet that was designed to expand when it hit something. This was a brutal piece of technology. It caused absolutely devastating wounds that surgeons just couldn't fix. The mini-ball is a huge reason why the casualty numbers in the Civil War were just so shockingly high. So, to be able to fire this deadly weapon in the chaos of battle, soldiers had to drill the loading process over and over and over again. It was called the Manual of Arms. Step 1, handle cartridge. 2, tear cartridge with your teeth. 3, pour the powder down the barrel. 4, insert the bullet. 5, draw the rammer. 6, ram the cartridge home.
They did this relentlessly until it was pure muscle memory. I mean, veterans could still rattle off those steps perfectly decades after the war was over. And this right here, this is maybe the single most tragic part of the entire war. The tactics were old, but the weapons were new. You had generals ordering their men to march shoulder to shoulder in these tight formations, right, that worked in the old days of inaccurate muskets, but now they were marching straight into the fire of these incredibly accurate, incredibly deadly rifle muskets. The result was just unimaginable slaughter. Old tactics plus new weapons equals massive, massive casualties.
So how do you keep men marching into that kind of fire? With absolute iron-fisted discipline. If you were slacking off, you might get stuck digging latrines. Nasty, but you'd live. But for something bigger, like cowardice or theft, you could get bucked and gagged, tied up in a painful position and left for everyone to see. And for the worst offenses, like desertion or treachery, the punishment was death by firing squad.
But, life wasn't all drill and terror 24/7. In fact, one of the biggest enemies was just sheer boredom. So, let's move on to our next section, Between the Battles, Fighting Boredom and Staying Connected. What did these guys do to fight off the monotony and, stay connected to their real life? First up, let's talk about money, or the lack of it. In 1863, a Union private was paid a whopping $13 a month, and most guys sent nearly all of that home to their families, which left them with almost nothing. And that little bit of cash they did have, it could disappear in a heartbeat. And where did that money go? Well, it often went to a guy called the sutler. A sutler was basically a civilian merchant who followed the army around. Think of it like a rolling convenience store. They sold stuff like soap, canned fruit, maybe a better knife. But here's the catch. The prices were absolutely insane. A soldier could blow his entire month's pay on just a couple of small luxuries. And for the Confederate soldiers, sutlers were almost non-existent, so they had to hope for packages from home or try to buy things from local farms.
So, without much money, what did they do for fun? Well, the number one activity by far was writing letters home. This was their absolute lifeline. Mail call was the most exciting part of any day, no question. Besides that, they did what guys do. They played cards, they pitched horseshoes, they'd read any newspaper or book they could get their hands on. And they even started playing that newfangled sport called baseball.
All right, for our final section, let's bring all this together and talk about a soldier's humanity, finding home on the battlefield. Because with all the filth, the fear, the constant exhaustion of war, how did these men manage to hang on to what made them human? How did they possibly find a sense of home out there?
Well, one way, and this might surprise you, was with animals. A lot of soldiers kept pets. We're talking dogs, cats. I've even read about pet raccoons. One soldier wrote that a pet was a soothing connection with home. And that's just perfect, isn't it? It was a living, breathing piece of a kinder world. Get this, one Wisconsin regiment had a pet bald eagle named Old Abe that they actually carried into battle on a special perch. How wild is that?
And some of these mascots became absolute legends. There's the story of Sally, the dog of the 11th Pennsylvania. After the horror of Gettysburg, she was found on the battlefield, standing guard over the bodies of her fallen soldiers. Her loyalty was so famous that today you can see a statue of her on their monument at Gettysburg. Just incredible. Faith, of course, was another critical anchor for so many men. Army chaplains were essential. They held church services, they comforted the wounded, they'd even write letters home for men who couldn't write themselves. And there's this one incredibly powerful story of Father William Corby, a chaplain with the Irish Brigade. Right before they made a desperate charge at Gettysburg, he stood on a rock and gave a general absolution to all the men. It's one of the most famous images of faith from the entire war. So, when you put it all together, it really comes down to this, doesn't it? From naming their little huts after fancy hotels, to treasuring every single letter, to finding comfort in a loyal dog, these soldiers were always trying to create some little piece of home in the middle of hell. They were trying to find normalcy in the most abnormal place on earth. And that kind of leaves us with a big question to think about, right? When you strip away the uniform, when you strip away the more than 150 years between us and them, what does a soldier's life really teach us about our own deep, profound, and universal need for a place to call home?